My name is Alicia Olson, and I'm a user experience designer at Tableau Software, and I've been working here for about 5 years. I want you to raise your hand if you've ever used a Tableau dashboard that made you feel confused, lost, frustrated. Me too. I have some good news for you today. It's not your fault. It's the dashboard designer's fault. Now, maybe you weren't the audience for that confusing dashboard, but maybe you were. And maybe that dashboard designer didn't really know what you needed to get out of it. Today, I'm going to teach you how to apply design thinking to your dashboard creation process so that you don't make dashboards that confuse other people. But first, what is user experience design? It's actually about psychology. It's about learning how other people think. We're trying to figure out how our users approach problems that they're trying to solve and give them what they need before they know they need it. Before I move on, I want you to think about a dashboard you've used that you absolutely loved. If you don't have a dashboard in mind, think of something else that you use often. What do you like about it? Why? These types of things are actually a lot harder to come up with because we honestly don't think about things that just work, when in fact a lot more work goes into creating these types of experiences. But designers aren't magical unicorns, and we don't just know what to create for people so that it's a great experience. We use something called the design process to help guide our thinking and understand the people who we're designing for. Today, I'll introduce you to this process and teach you how to apply this to your dashboards so that you can make them more appropriate for your users. Let's get started. There are 4 parts of this process. First, we have discover. Here, we're understanding who is going to be using the dashboard. We're going to be gathering a ton of information from our users and discovering what they need to do with their data. Next, we have distill. Here, we're going to find patterns in our notes and come up with a couple main goals that the dashboard should accomplish. Once we've settled on these goals, we move on to ideation. This is where we're finding creative solutions to all those goals that we decided on and moving from a list of goals to an actual dashboard that's going to accomplish them. Towards the end of the ideation phase, we're going to start filtering, but the time for our most critical eye is in the validate phase. And this is where we're looking at where we can improve the dashboard to better align with what our users need. Ideally, we'll also be engaging with our users again to understand what doesn't click for them. One great way to think about this process is that the first 2 phases are about solving the right problem. If we skip this, we may come up with a really awesome dashboard that just addresses the wrong things. The last 2 phases are about making sure that we solve the problems the right way once we know what our focus is. During this talk, I have a section on each of these where I'm going to give you a couple important things to keep in mind, as well as some techniques that you can apply during your dashboard creation process. So you're going to leave the room today with the ability to think like a designer. I want to be clear, though, we're just scratching the surface. There's a lot that goes into this, so I'm just giving you a taste of it. Before jumping right into the discover phase, I have mentioned our user a few times, and I want to take a moment to define who that is. And I'm going to tell you a story. This is my dad. And as you can tell from this picture here, he's a mechanic, and he's a very organized one at that. A couple years ago, my dad finally decided that he was getting an iPhone, and I was really proud of him. He spent a while looking at the specs and figuring out exactly what he wanted. And one thing he figured out pretty quickly was that he was definitely going to get a case with this phone so that he could keep it protected in the shop. Any guesses on what kind of case he bought? There you go, good work. He went for the OtterBox. And just knowing a couple things about my dad, we can deduce what kind of case was most appropriate for him. It protected this expensive piece of equipment that he decided that he'd spent a long time deciding to buy, and he got the biggest, bulkiest OtterBox he could possibly find. This is a picture of the actual model he went for the first time. And I made fun of him for this, because honestly, in my opinion, why even buy an iPhone if you're going to do this to it? It's such a beautiful piece of hardware, and the OtterBox makes it harder to use. But his dedication to this OtterBox was only strengthened when he lost his phone later that year. It was nowhere to be found for about a week. And he called me the next Sunday and told me he had found it. He was mowing the lawn, and it was outside. My parents live in Florida, and it rains a lot there. And I immediately said, oh my goodness, I'm so sorry. I offered to send him one of my old phones. And he just laughed at me and told me, you didn't let me finish. The phone's fine, it works, not a drop of water damage. OtterBox has a customer for life. Now there are tons of companies who make iPhone cases, and this picture shows just a subset of them. But most of these would be terrible for my dad. And that's not because they're inherently bad iPhone cases. They're just made for people who aren't my dad. Just like that OtterBox case he has wasn't made for me. So I made a mistake when I was talking to him about this phone case. I incorrectly assumed that since I also had an iPhone, I was a representative user. But I'm not. Even though my dad and I are both iPhone users, we're very different people. This story illustrates how important it is to know who we're designing for and to know what their goals are for this dashboard that you're going to be designing. You'll probably also run into some more people who seem like they might be the user, but they aren't. You may have seen these guys before. They're pretty uppity, they're not totally in touch with the people who are doing most of the work, and they think they're more important than they actually are. HIPPO stands for a highly paid person's opinion. Now, many times, these opinions are going to come from a manager or a representative of the team that's asking you for this dashboard. But it's important to remember that when you're getting information about what needs to be in the dashboard, that this person is not your user. They're your customer. And a customer is someone who does have a stake in the dashboard being created, but they're not really going to be using it that much. They may have their own set of requirements for you, which are great to be aware of. But make sure that they're not the only person you're talking to. Your user is the person who is going to be using this dashboard more than anyone else. It's not you, and it's not your HIPPO. So now that we know who we're going to talk to, let's go back to those 4 phases. For the rest of the talk, I'm going to be walking through them all in more detail. During the discover phase, our goal is to find out what our users really need from us. And our users can be misleading because they're going to try to solve their own problems. And they'll tell you what solution they're interested in rather than telling you the problem that led them to that solution in the first place. Your job is to take those solutions they're giving you and figure out what that problem was. So during this phase, we want to make sure that we question the obvious. There are really no stupid questions here. And what this mantra helps us do is question all of our base assumptions and break down the ones that were incorrect. So I'm going to tell you about a technique that will help you do just that. It's called the 5 whys. And this technique is exactly what it sounds like. You're just going to ask why 5 times. The goal here is not to act like a 2-year-old, though. It's more of a guideline to get you to push yourself beyond the obvious, ask those stupid questions, and get to the heart of what your users really need. So this example is centered around a friend of my dad's. His name is Mr. Massey, and he owns a Toyota shop. It's called Massey Toyota. Now, John Massey wanted a dashboard that was going to help him make business decisions about his shop. I'm going to walk you through the user interview process using the 5 whys as an example. The first thing that John asked me for was a dashboard that shows the year and make of vehicles over time coming into his shop. The first thing I asked him was, why do you need to see this information? That's obvious, he told me. I need to understand what cars are coming into my shop. Now, I could have stopped here. I could have figured I just asked a really stupid question and got on with building the dashboard, and it would have looked something like this. This dashboard optimizes for what cars are coming into his shop, and it allows him to explore. This is exactly what John asked me for, and a lot of us probably do stop here. This even does more than he expected it to do, because he's only ever seen static dashboards before, so here he can click on a Prius, for example, and the rest of the dashboard is going to filter to help him understand the distribution of Priuses coming into the shop. But if we keep asking some questions about the purpose here, we can do better, and I'll show you how. Instead of giving him this dashboard, I asked him, why do you need to understand what cars are coming into your shop? What John told me is that he's trying to figure out what parts he needs to keep on hand. Some of them are pretty expensive, but if he's going through them consistently, he wants to have them around. And that's a new insight that we have here. It sounds like the dashboard shouldn't be about the cars as much as it is about what parts are sitting in the shop. That's a totally different dashboard we could build. But a couple things came to my mind when I was thinking about why he wanted to know this information. So just take a second and think about that for yourselves. The first thing that came to my mind was cost. It sounded like John didn't want to have cash tied up in his parts if he wasn't going to be using them. The other thing for me was efficiency. If those parts aren't on hand, John would have to order them. And he kind of already talked about both of these things, but I'm really not sure how much each of them is a factor in what he's looking for. At this point, I could just ask him directly about the cost of parts versus the efficiency of the shop and what he'd like to see in that dashboard. But that is a leading question, since it doesn't leave room for the answer to be about something that's not cost or efficiency. Which brings me to another point. Try not to ask questions that encourage people to give one of a few answers. Keep those questions open-ended. This also applies to yes or no questions, because those encourage your users to just say yes or no, and they won't elaborate about why. Instead, I'm going to stick to that script and ask John why he needs to know what parts to keep on hand. What John told me was that he'd like more information about which vehicles are waiting on part shipments. So this was more about efficiency. At this point, it feels like we're starting to get a better understanding of what John wants to get out of this data, but we have two more whys to ask. And I'll go through these two a little quicker since I think you're all starting to get the point. When I asked why it's important to know when a vehicle is waiting on a part shipment, John told me that he wants to know about any time a vehicle isn't being actively worked on. And parts are one reason that can happen, but there are a couple other reasons as well. Finally, when I said, why do you want to know about this? John told me that he wants to eliminate wasted time in his shop. So just take a moment and look at these series of answers that John gave me. We started with year and make of vehicle over time and ended with eliminating wasted time in the shop. And this only took me about 10 minutes of conversation to get to, and I really understand more about why he wants this dashboard. So given everything that we found out, here's the dashboard that I actually made him. It does a better job of addressing his problems, and you can see some of the original charts are still there. They weren't totally throwaway charts, but I've added two more. The one on the left shows efficiency broken down by job type, and the one on the right shows vehicles on hold by category of reasons they could be on hold, as well as the category of job. Next, I'm going to give you one more way that you can get information out of your users. This one's called Contextual Inquiry. And this is just a fancy term, which means watch people do their job today and ask them questions about it while they're doing it. If you're using this technique, it is important to make your users feel comfortable. Sometimes people might think that you're coming in to evaluate them, judge them. So give them information about why you're actually there, and ask them to teach you how to do things if you don't understand what's going on. A great example of the power of this technique comes from a design firm called IDEO. They were asked by a medical device producer to design a device that nurses would use to enter data during a very specific medical procedure. And they kind of had a vision of something in mind already. It was a sleek gadget, kind of like an iPad that the nurses would use. They'd hold it in one hand and enter data with the other. When they spoke with the nurses about this concept, the nurses were completely on board. But when the designers from IDEO observed the nurses during the procedure, they noticed something really important. The first thing every single nurse did was hold the patient's hand. The patient happened to be conscious during this operation, and they were usually scared. They were getting a needle inserted into their back. This basic human interaction was so intuitive that no one even remembered they did it when they were being interviewed about it. So here's the device that IDEO ended up designing. It's one-handed with buttons on the side so nurses can continue to hold the patient's hand while they're entering data about the procedure. And this isn't sleek or sexy, but it does the job well, and that's what's important. I have one final point to make and discover before we move on, and that is to have conversations, not interviews. While it is a really great idea to have a set of questions that you want to make sure you ask your users, don't keep the conversation too directed. This is a chance for you to get to know them better. So if some interesting tangent comes up, follow it for a while. Once we've finished discovery, we should have a pretty good idea of who our users are. And we probably have a ton of ideas forming in our head about how to solve their problems. At this point, I have even usually started to sketch out sort of half-formed ideas of visualizations I might want. But trying to build everything that they've asked for, or everything we've come up with, can lead to dashboards like this. This workbook has a ton of dashboards and sheets in it, but it does have a learning curve to find what you're looking for unless you're the person who built it. When you do a couple user interviews, but you don't have your own perspective at the end of it, you can end up trying to do everything all at once. While there are places where this could be appropriate, 9 times out of 10, it's not what you want. And that's why the next phase, distill, is important. This is where we're going to take a step back and develop a perspective about the goals that this dashboard should accomplish. Here's what we're deciding what we're going to do and what we're not going to do. You're going to start this phase with a ton of notes from your user interviews. This is actually a picture of notes that I took during one single user interview. They're pretty disorganized, but this is what they look like. It's kind of fun. And we're going to focus here on what our users need, not what they want. I've heard a lot of stories about people asking for things like tables or specific views during that discover phase. But if you've asked why during the discover, you should be able to understand the reasons people wanted these types of views and pull those reasons into your goals so that you can address the reasons the user actually wanted those things rather than just building them outright. Instead of going right from notes in a dashboard, we're going to answer these 3 questions by the end of the phase. We're doing this because the answers to these questions are going to help us stay sane and guide us when we're brainstorming and putting together that final dashboard. They're going to keep us on track so that we don't try to do too much all at once. And they're going to serve as the first bar that all of our ideas need to pass to make it. Sometimes it's pretty easy to come up with answers to these questions. For example, who for the dashboard with John is just John. But if your dashboard has multiple people, it might be something like employees who are traveling or conference attendees looking for the best food in the city. Even with all those notes in front of you from your users, though, coming up with more nuanced answers to these questions can feel kind of arbitrary. So that's why I give this a little more structure by beginning looking for insights. And these insights are going to help us find answers to those questions. So during the distill phase, we're going from notes to insights to goals. Insights might be things like, my users look at Tableau in every meeting for answers, or my users really like to screen cap dashboard examples and send them around on Slack. I'm going to give you 2 visual techniques that are really helpful when you're trying to understand all the information from your user notes. The first one is called Affinity Mapping. This is a great technique to help organize your notes visually, understand bigger areas of interest for your users, and sift through a ton of information. What you're going to do here is write each note down on a sticky note or a note card, and don't stress too much about what exactly a note is. The goal is just to get all the different pieces of information from your user interviews into a format where you can organize them and move them around. This is an example of a note that I took from my conversation with John, and you can see here it's pretty stream of consciousness. That's totally fine. And I don't have any categories yet, so I'm going to give this a category. This one kind of seems like it's about jobs stagnating, so give it a header, stagnation. And then I'm going to pull up another note. This one doesn't seem like it belongs in stagnation to me. It seems more like it's about looking for outliers in the data, so I'll make a new category, outliers. And I'm going to continue doing this until all of my notes are up on the board and organized. And now it's really easy to see a map of our whole conversation. And I want to point out there's some purple ones on the side. Those ones are things I color-coded differently because these were details about how an auto shop runs that I personally wasn't familiar with. So I'm going to be using these for reference later as I build the dashboard. But everything on the left side, that's my conversation I had with him. I used this map to help me understand what was and wasn't as important to John, and informed those goals that I wanted to accomplish for his dashboard. One example was that John did really need to understand outliers in his data. We had talked about this a lot, and I made it an explicit goal for this dashboard to really allow exploration, filtering, and give him more low-level data when he needed it. I'm going to walk you through one more visual example. This one is called pattern identification. And this is another technique that'll help you see patterns in your notes, but this one is useful when you have 3 or more users because it really helps you understand how your users are similar to or different from one another. I'm going to use a different case study to walk you through this one. You may have heard of the new Tableau e-learning program. This is a program that lets anyone take a more targeted Tableau class online rather than needing to schedule a more intensive and expensive in-person session. We wanted to make sure that while we were offering this new program, we weren't losing our overall revenue, and we were also reaching more customers. The executive team at Tableau asked for a dashboard to help them understand how the program was going so we could make changes if we needed to. For context, here's the dashboard we ended up with. Let's go from how we went from notes to goals, and we ultimately got to this dashboard. We interviewed 3 executives at Tableau who were going to be using this. And we asked them a few questions about how they use their dashboards and interact with their data today, as well as asking about how this might fit into their current workflow when they thought they'd use it. The first person we interviewed was Andre. He's in charge of trainings at Tableau, and I would just like to point out I've anonymized all of this. We had quite a few takeaways from Andre, but here's a subset of them. We also interviewed Beth. She manages the sales group for Tableau trainings, and here are a couple takeaways from our interview with her. Finally, we interviewed Charles. He's not an executive, but he does work with that team quite a bit. And here are a few takeaways from that interview. So what we did here was we looked at all of our notes, and this is different from Affinity Mapping because we are keeping everything organized by user. We're focusing instead on how they're similar to and different from each other. So we kind of took everything that was similar and tried to put it in the same column while keeping it organized by user. And now we're looking for patterns. One thing we noticed from this set of notes was that there's a common thread with our executives about being too busy to really know how to understand where all the dashboards are on server. And because of this, they didn't check their actual dashboards as often as they wanted to. Things change too fast, and they have too much going on. But they did genuinely want to stay updated. We obviously took a lot more notes than I can fit on this slide. But using all of them with this technique, we found a couple insights. Here are some of them written out. We then translated these insights into some of our goals. I want to point out 2 things here. One is that each insight doesn't need to map to a single goal. They can be grouped like we did here, or you can split it up. So if you have one insight that you think the dashboard needs to do multiple things to address, that's completely fine. The second thing is that these goals don't say how we're going to accomplish them, and that is incredibly purposeful. Here in Distill, we just want to say what we're trying to accomplish. We're going to look at how we're accomplishing these things later. Now we use these goals to inform that final dashboard. Here it is again. In order to address these 2 goals, we did a few things. We formatted this dashboard for email and mobile, so this actually scrolls off the screen. It's pretty long. We also put the most important information at the top and all the info up front. We did that because our executives, we found, really used email all the time. And if they got something emailed to them consistently, they would look at it, and if they needed to explore, they could then click on it and go into server. We also came up with a few other goals from the rest of our notes. One was that we needed to communicate big wins. We did this we have this cumulative revenue chart here, and originally we were going to just have a line chart, but in order to communicate those bigger wins, we put a bar chart underneath it, so one of our users could really see when those wins came in. And if we scroll down to the bottom of the dashboard here, we can see more about the top deals and impact of e-learning on our total revenue. And as expected, it's actually improving Tableau's bottom line while helping all of our customers get more out of our running program. So it's a win-win. One last thought in this phase is that during pattern identification, you might find that you actually have groups of users who are different from one another, and they need different things. If you at all can, I would recommend that in this case, you just make multiple dashboards for these different people, because that's going to help you make what's appropriate for each person using it. If you can't do that for whatever reason, I would suggest that you prioritize one user over another. So sometimes you'll have 5 users who do one thing and 2 that are a little bit different. In that case, make the dashboard lean towards the bigger group, and maybe give the other people something else in the dashboard that they needed too. Finally, you can make use of interactivity to kind of make a choose your own adventure dashboard if you do really have a ton of different users and you need to make one dashboard. Once we finish the distill phase, we should feel pretty confident in our set of goals and know that we're solving the right problems for our users. During the second half of this process, we're going to be solving the problem the right way. This tends to be a bit more fuzzy and more iterative than the first half of this process, and we're also going to keep going back and forth between ideate and validate. As we do this, we're also going to continue referencing all the work we did in the first half of this process, because it helps keep us on track. The next part of the process is called ideate, and this is where we're taking all of those goals from the distill phase and determining how we're going to address them in a dashboard. This is a huge phase because we're starting with just a set of goals and we're ending with either a prototype of a dashboard or an actual draft of a dashboard or even multiple dashboards in Tableau. But if you're building dashboards, you're ideating already. So don't kid yourself, don't pretend you haven't started brainstorming already. It's really hard not to start coming up with something during the first half of the process. It's just what we naturally do. So write everything down and then put it aside. You can reference it later. Then take all of your goals that you came up with in Distill and put them in front of you. The next thing we're going to do is push ourselves beyond those first ideas that we came up with. I'm going to give you 2 techniques here, and the first one is called Crazy Eights. This is going to help push yourself and come up with more ideas. What you're going to do here is come up with 8 ideas in 5 minutes. 8 different ideas, not just riffs on one idea. This may seem like a silly exercise, but there's a good reason that we do it. One thing our brains like to do naturally is just start judging our thoughts and ideas as soon as we have them. We'll say, oh, that's not really good enough to write down, or that's okay, but does it really make the cut? If you only have 5 minutes, everything makes the cut. You don't have time to filter. Second technique here is called blue sky thinking. And this one is a little bit more structured than Crazy Eights, and it's another great option. Blue sky thinking encourages creativity by forcing us to combine the mundane with the fantastical. The first thing you're going to do here is come up with what's called a ground idea for each of the goals that you came up with in the distill phase. Ground ideas are usually just the first idea that you come up with. They're probably okay, they're probably reasonable, they're grounded in reality, but they're not very creative. Still, write them down. Next, we're gonna come up with what's called a blue sky idea. And this is where we can use any technique we want to solve our problem. A good way to think about it is, if you could wave a magic wand, you're in Harry Potter, how would you solve this problem? And these are called blue sky ideas because they're very much not grounded in reality. It's okay if they're crazy. Once we have both of these ideas for each of our goals, we're going to try to combine them into something truly creative. And these are normally called mountain ideas because they still are grounded in reality, but they're much more exciting than being on the ground. The outcome of these brainstorming sessions might be individual vizzes, they might be drawings or ideas for a viz, or they might be creative ways to add interactivity to your entire dashboard so that you're showing the right information to your users at the right time. Once we have a ton of ideas, the next part of ideation is connecting the dots. Here we're going to be pulling all of this work we've done into a coherent dashboard. As we do this, continue pulling those goals back and thinking through your work in context of them. If you have a couple ideas for a viz that will accomplish a goal, list out all the pros and cons of those ideas and go through with the most appropriate one. And this isn't a science, it's really an art. During this part of the process, I personally find that it's helpful to look at dashboards I already like. So I clip them when I see them. Here's an example of one that I clipped. This dashboard is about a boat race from Washington State to Alaska that was done without motors. And I liked this because it is able to give the user a ton of information while using data to augment this story that's being told. I also clipped it because I really liked this circular map in the corner and the way that they used the coastline to kind of add to the layout. It's just not something I would have thought of, so I keep it around for inspiration. I want to give a shout out as well to the Big Book of Dashboards. This book is seriously like a recipe book for your dashboards. There are so many examples that one of them is going to be similar to something you're trying to do. This is a great book to keep on your desk for inspiration if you're someone who does create dashboards regularly. The last thing you're going to do before you move on to validation, once you have a full dashboard, is check the basics. And these basics are things that pretty much every dashboard should do. There are tons of great blog posts and books about these types of things, so I'm not going to go through every single thing, but I'll give you some that I personally prioritize. On the interaction side, here are some of them. I am really a stickler about not making my users scroll within vizzes. I would rather have 4, 5, or 6 visualizations on a single dashboard than have 10 or 12 where the user has to kind of figure out where in that viz they want to focus. It's just easier, and it does keep you more focused. On the visual side, these are 3 that I like to keep in mind. I personally really like get it right in black and white because that also helps you with interaction. If you start making your dashboard in black and white, you're going to focus on the interactivity of that dashboard and the data layout before you focus on the colors and the visuals, which is that's just going to help you make a great dashboard to begin with. Once you get it right in black and white, you can start adding color, which is also going to help you use that color mindfully and consistently. Here we're trying to think about using color because we need it, not because Tableau gave us the Tableau 10 or Tableau 20 by default. Once you've checked all of these things, you're on your way to a pretty solid dashboard. We know who our users are, we know what we want to do, and we have 1 or more different dashboards or prototypes that we think solve our users' problems. But before we send these out into the world, it's really helpful to validate that what we've come up with actually works for our users. After all, we have done a lot of work since the last time we talked to them. The final part of the design process is called validate. During this phase, we're going to take those ideas we think we're moving forward with and looking at them more critically. And we're also ideally getting some feedback from our users here. The amount of validation that's necessary here is going to depend on how important your dashboard is. This is totally up to you. The first thing you can do in validation is really easy. Try to break your own ideas. This doesn't involve anyone else. This is just you. But you need to be in the right mindset for this to be effective, and that is to be a detective. To do this, you need to really get into your user's head. You're going to walk through the motions that your user would actually go through and try to accomplish their goals as if you'd never seen the dashboard before. And here it can be tempting to just kind of mentally go through everything, but if you actually go through those motions, you'll find things that you wouldn't find if you didn't do it physically. When doing this, I like to think of a particular episode of Brooklyn Nine-Nine. If you haven't seen this show, it's about detectives, and it's great, and you should watch it. During this episode in particular, our main character loses his girlfriend. And in this scene, he's actually walking around New York pretending to be her. So here, he physically pretends to have a cigarette because he knows that this is where she would have stopped to have one, and he turns around and he sees something across the street that helps him find her. Once you're done being a detective, go back and fix everything that you need to fix now. You found a bunch of gaps, and you don't want to waste your users' time by asking them about things that you know you already need to fix. The next thing you can do in Validate is go get lightweight feedback. This is quick feedback from colleagues or your users. You can do this with just 10-minute conversations or via email. This is going to get more eyes on the dashboard than yours, which means they're going to see things differently than you are. One trick that I like to use when I'm getting feedback from people is to pretend that a colleague built it. When you're doing a lot of work for someone and you give them something that kind of almost hits the mark, they have a tendency to just be nice to you and say, yeah, that's great, even when it's not really there yet. If they think that you're asking questions on behalf of someone else, they're going to be more honest with you about its flaws. So remember that e-learning dashboard we talked about earlier? This is what we emailed to our executives at first, and this isn't even a real dashboard. This is a prototype that we made to play with the layout and charts we're showing without needing to worry about wrangling the actual data viz details just yet. And you'll notice here we didn't follow our own advice about color. And because of that, we got a lot of feedback from our executives that the color scheme didn't match up and it was confusing. That was something we could have fixed ahead of time, and we honestly should have. But we did get some good feedback from them as well. This is one question that we got. And we had a chart in here that was supposed to answer this question. It was this one. We could have taught our executives how to read this chart, but the problem here is that our executives didn't know how to without our help. So instead of telling them what this chart was supposed to be showing them, we went back and forth a little bit, had some more conversations, and ended up with this new view, which gave them what they actually needed to see in a way that they understood it more intuitively. Just for reference, here's the old and new dashboards that we made for our executives side by side. The changes here might seem small, but they did really help our executives get what they needed out of this dashboard faster. Lightweight feedback is usually enough feedback. This is usually where I stop. But if you do have a really important dashboard, maybe you're going to be showing it to a ton of people, maybe you're not going to have a chance to go back and change it once you get feedback later, you might want to do some user testing. This is the process of actually watching people use your dashboard in a test environment. This is more time-consuming, but it's really valuable because you're actually watching someone use what you've built, and you're going to develop more empathy when you see someone struggle in real life, and you'll also have more of a sense of how to fix it. Now, a lot of research has been done on user testing, and I'm not going to get into it all. There are so many books written about the best ways to user test. But I will leave you with a few pointers if this is something you're interested in. The first one is to give your users a task or a series of tasks to do. This makes the conversation a lot more realistic than just walking them through your dashboard, and it lets you see what they would actually do if you weren't sitting right there with them, telling them what to do. Make sure to ask in this conversation if the task that you ask them to do is something that they would actually want to do with the dashboard. And make sure that they know you're not testing them, you're testing the dashboard. So anything that they can't figure out, that's the dashboard's fault, it's not theirs. Next, ask your users to think aloud. This is a really hard thing to do because most of the time when people are using software, they're not really talking to it or talking about everything that they're doing with it. But you do want to understand your user's thought process here. So if they click on something and they need to go back, prompt them, ask why they went back and what they expected to happen. Maybe you'll actually be able to make that happen for them next time around. So with all of this, you may be wondering, when are you finished? And as we all know, perfect is the enemy of done. I usually know I'm done when people can complete all of those mainline tasks without my help. And it's okay if they struggle a tiny bit but then figure it out. The point is that they ultimately can do it on their own. This was all a lot of information, so let's recap. We talked about these 4 parts of the design process. I'm going to introduce you to one more way to think about them. This is called the double diamond. This shows the different types of thinking that you're doing in these different parts of the process. That's what the shape of the diamond means. So as the diamond expands, you're expanding your thinking. This is called divergent thinking. And as the diamond comes back together, this is called convergent thinking. We're converging on one idea, a couple goals, or the final dashboard that we're going to be using. Here are all the techniques that I went through with you today. I also have some printouts of this slide up here, and they are with the door managers at this door over here on your left. So you can go get them from them. I won't feel bad if you don't come up here. And I want to reiterate that this is an iterative process. So if you miss something, that's totally fine. Just go back. You might find that you're in the distill phase and you really need to know one more thing from your user. Go back and ask them. Use what's useful for you and throw out what doesn't. You don't have to go through this whole thing start to finish. You can just say, you know what, I already have a pretty great dashboard and I want to make it better. Go through and validate and figure out what you can do to make it better. This is all here to help you. So if it's not helping, don't use that part of it. I have one last thought for you today, and that is that good design is knowing your trade-offs. Every single dashboard that you build will be a balance between a couple things: the data you have, your Tableau skills, Tableau's own limitations, your time, and what your users need from you. Good design is not about making everything perfect. It's about making the right things as good as they need to be. So, I would like to remind you to please complete the session survey. In the TC18 app, we actually do read every single thing that you write for us, and it helps us make our talks better for next year. I actually gave this same talk last year and made some improvements based on the feedback I got. Finally, if you're interested and you want to learn more about user experience, these are 4 resources that I love. First one, Design of Everyday Things. That's another kind of scratch the surface book that will give you more information than I could give you in this hour. The Interaction Design Foundation has a ton of resources and a ton, like so many more techniques in each of these phases. Project Guide to UX Design is awesome if you're looking to figure out how to implement some of this in your organization. And the Handbook of Usability Testing is a really great guide to learn how to start usability testing. With that, I am done, and I will open it up to questions. Yes? Okay, so the question was, how long does it take for you to build a good dashboard? That honestly depends on how many people I have and what's going on. So the one for John Massey, we had a conversation. I got the data. I went through it. That was maybe a week, kind of on the side in my evening times. The e-learning dashboard was something that it was a group of people at Tableau who built it for the executives, and we didn't have the data yet when we were building that dashboard. So because of that, that took a little bit longer, and there was a bit more back and forth because we knew we really wanted to get it right for a group of people. So I would say anywhere from a couple days to like 3 or 4 weeks, depending on the complexity of the data. Yes? Cool. So the question was, is it useful to have one person who's focused on UX in a group, or to have everybody in the group be focused on UX? Honestly, you can go either way. So at Tableau, I mean, we have developers who develop our code, and we have UX designers, so I work on the user experience design of the product. That can be useful to do. I would say if you're going to do that and have those developers be focused on development, that they need to have an appreciation and a little bit of an understanding of what user experience design is. Because if they don't, the designer can come in and say, okay, well, there's this, this, and this, and the developers will go, well, that's just hard, so I'm not going to do that, if they don't understand why the UX designer is making those suggestions. And then on the other side, the UX designer does have to understand what's difficult and what's not. There are trade-offs. Like if something's really hard to do because of the data structure, it might not be worth it, even though it's something that the user would really benefit from. Yeah. I don't see any more hands, so like wave them very high. Yes. Yeah.
This experience is a lot different than my user's experience when it comes to building a report. How do you kind of subvert and change the paradigm that this is a very process and it's a much different experience for the user to work this way than it was to go and say how they want to push the reports like that?
Okay. Can you summarize your question for me so I can summarize it?
This is great if you're working with a user that is that's interested in data storage as well.
Yeah.
How do you start to make this work in an organization that's still kind of prepared for analytics?
So how do you make this work for people who only want reports and don't want to interact with their data too much?
You said that so much better than I did.
Great. So the e-learning example is actually a really interesting one for that, because despite these executives being people who normally do really want to interact with all their data, most of the time with this dashboard, they needed like a quick, here's a report that they could see so that they knew the numbers for their next meeting. That was the most important thing for them. And we did make it a link so they could interact later. But it's something that you're not going to be able to go from we want reports to we want interactivity immediately. That's a leap. So I would do it slowly, and my suggestion would be make reports that kind of beg some people to ask questions. Make something where someone goes, that's interesting, maybe I'll click on that, and oh dear, I'm in Tableau Server now, maybe I can do some cool things. So add little bits of interactivity, and people will get used to it, people will acclimate to that, and then they'll start wanting it once they see it. Yeah. I think, oh. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
What would you suggest for, that was amazing, but I don't know how you break that down to
yeah.
quick.
Uh-huh.
Sketch it out, I guess? Or?
Yeah. So the question was, my work culture needs things pretty immediately, and this is a lot. One, yes, this can take a really long time if you really go through each phase. You can spend a year going through something like this if you wanted to, right? But there's something called a design sprint, and we actually do this at Tableau if there's something that we have that we want an answer to really fast because we have a meeting with our higher level executives about direction of the product. There are resources online for design sprints. Google famously does design sprints, and they've published everything online. And what a sprint is you just basically go through this process in a day, 3 hours, 5 days, and your discover is I talked to someone for an hour, and now I'm going to do the sticky notes, and here's the thing, and I made a decision, and we move on. Even doing it that quickly can help you more than just being I'm going to build the thing they asked for. Yeah. Oh, hi. Sorry. I'm blinded by these lights.
So we ran out of your handouts. Is there a place online people can get this?
All of the slides will be up. I don't know where, but we always publish them online. They'll probably send you an email or be in the TC conference app. I also have 20 more. Sure, yeah. I also have some business cards up here if anyone wants them. Did someone else have a question? You can also come up here and ask me questions quietly. That's also fine once my mic is off.